Thank you. Thank you, Jane. Morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I want to start with just a few questions. I'm not going to ask you to answer them, but just a few questions to think about while I'm talking. First is, what does it really mean to be healthy? Is it about, what determines our individual and collective health? Is it access to care, whether we're close to a doctor or a hospital? Is it where we live? Is it how we live? And finally, what affects us the most? I want to tell you a little bit about ourselves. As Jane said, I'm with Bon Secour Mercy Health. I work in Baltimore. We're part of the Baltimore health system. There's several Bon Secour facilities, of course, here in Virginia. But we were founded, at least in the United States, about 140 years ago in West Baltimore. And the Sisters of Bon Secour came to the same West Baltimore neighborhoods that we work in today and did home care nursing, provided child development services, and began a ministry that can be described as compassion, healing, and liberation. And we actually opened a hospital in 1919, but that was almost 40 years into the ministry, and I think that's pretty important when you look at how we got to where we are. You fast forward to the early 1990s, and there have been a lot of changes in Baltimore, like a lot of urban neighborhoods and urban communities across our country. And there have been a lot of population loss, and there are also a lot of crime and violence around drug trade and other kinds of things in the neighborhood that we serve. And it became clear to us that we needed to become more involved to address the real estate abandonment and the other things that we would now call social determinants of health in the neighborhoods surrounding our hospital. So we made 3 commitments. We went public with a plan we called Operation Reach Out in 1995. The first commitment of the 3 was we were going to do affordable housing development. The second, we were going to provide some kind of services to the folks in the new housing that we're going to develop. But the third, the most important commitment was we're not going to make any more unilateral decisions. We're going to do everything in partnership with the neighborhood. Now, back in 1995, we didn't really know what that meant. Today, we have some kind of an idea of what that means. This is our Healthy Communities Initiative model. And the success of this model, and models are models, right? They're just a depiction of something. It's not the real thing. But the success of our process begins and ends with community engagement. It takes place where our neighbors say they are. It means that we're in a listening mode. It's not about where we think they are. And the emphasis is really on walking with rather than doing for. Today, we've grown it to a affordable housing portfolio in the neighborhood of over 800 units. We're providing housing for the elderly. We're providing family housing, formerly homeless, disabled folks. We've got a division called Community Works that does career development, financial services, early childhood and family support. We've been involved in like activities here in Richmond, the East End revitalization work, helped establish the Maggie Walker Land Trust, but it all goes back to the Healthy Communities model of community engagement. Today we're, with the merger, with Mercy that we described earlier, we're now working on the social determinants of health in a more explicit and intentional way. I'm not going to, get into that too much, but the World Health Organization, defines the social determinants of health as the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, and age. And I think based on the discussion today at breakfast, the social determinants of health are most responsible for health inequities. They're the they have the most input, the most effect on the inequities that we have in health today. I'm going to focus on one of the 5 social determinants that have been determined by the Center for Disease Control, and that's neighborhood and physical environment. This Healthy Communities work has led us to be involved in numerous community planning initiatives. Most recently, they've morphed into the Community Health Needs Assessments, which are part of the Affordable Care Act. And what I want to emphasize is that commitment we made to listen drove us in a direction of dealing with very granular issues in the neighborhood. So for the first 15 years that we were doing neighborhood planning and doing community health planning, we focused on rats and trash. Why? Because our neighbors prioritized that time and time and time again. But then in 2016, when we did our second community health needs assessment, they prioritized crime and related trauma. And that's where things kind of got heavy for us, because we started screening everyone who came to Community Works, which is our social services division, or for housing assistant, for a number of mental health conditions, including post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And what we found, that of nearly 1,200 folks we screened, over 20% presented with PTSD. Now, to give you an idea of comparison, that's nearly 6 times the incidence that you would see in the general population, and that is comparable and sometimes greater than what men and women who are returning from combat in Vietnam, the Gulf War, first Gulf War, Afghanistan, and Iraq exhibit. So here we are in the United States, in West Baltimore, and we have combat level incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder. Focusing back on the physical, here's a model that a lot of folks are familiar with, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You have your food and shelter, your safety, love and belonging, esteem, and finally self-actualization. I put it next to the sisters' charism of compassion, healing, and liberation. So how do we get to self-actualization? Well, how do we get to liberation, as the sisters would put it? Well, when trauma gets in the way, we get blocked. And it's not just violence that traumatizes. I mean, it's well documented that we've had an incredibly high and unacceptable level of violence in places like West Baltimore. But also vacant buildings cause trauma. Neglected lots, social isolation, that all causes trauma. So the built environment can cause trauma, but the built environment can also be used to mitigate trauma. I'm going to tell you a quick story about a place called Kirby Lane Park. It's about 3.5 blocks from Bon Secour Hospital in Baltimore, and it's what we call in Baltimore an alley street, which is a side street off of a main street. And Kirby Lane was largely vacant. A couple of the houses had been torn down, but all the rest of them were vacant. And it was a site for illegal dumping. There was a lot of drug dealing going on out of there. And we met with a representative of a local church, a guy named Donald Quarles, who lived on the block, who really wanted to do something about it. And so we engaged people in the neighborhood, and the first thing we wanted to do was address the symptom, which is stop the dumping, so we built a fence. But that fence was built by a bunch of guys who like to play horseshoes. So we created a horseshoe pit. After the horseshoe pit, the guys who were playing horseshoes said, well, we'd like to have the little kids have a chance to come in here and play, so we built a playground. And then finally, some of the guys who had become involved in 12-step programs said, we should have a serenity garden. So we built a serenity garden. And so at the end of the day, what we had was a space that had been conceived and created by the neighborhood that allowed for authentic, truthful, and accurate conversations around the trauma. And this is necessary. We need these spaces in order for people to address what they're dealing with. So back to the industry. Where is the industry headed? I think healthcare has recognized that clinical improvements can only get us but so far. Cost containment can only get us so far. There's going to be an increasing emphasis on the social determinants of health. All across the country, health systems are investing, even as part of the efforts that Jody talked about and that Jane talked about earlier, are investing in these sort of activities. But I would posit that if we don't have authentic, robust community engagement, that we as healthcare providers, but also those of us that are community development practitioners, those of us that are lenders, those of us that are philanthropists, if we're not present with the folks we're trying to serve, with the change that we're trying to affect, if we're not walking with the folks, if we're not listening to, then we're not only going to get but so far, even if we focus on all the right things. We believe that it works, and and that it's really about our connection to each other that causes us the ability to make real improvements. So back to my original questions. What affects us the most? I have to tell you, I'm still not sure, despite all this experience. But I do believe in the words that come out of the neighborhoods and the neighborhoods that we serve. So I'm going to go back to Donald Quarles, the guy I referenced before. Donald says, all of us have our hurts, habits, and hang-ups, but we all need healing. And I think that's really the truth behind the matter. So thank you.